Honoria Whitcliffe had a steel verge spring half set between her fingers when the knock came, and she did not put it down. The letter the carrier had brought up from Skipton lay on the workbench beside the dismantled going train of a bracket clock, its black morning wax already broken, and she had read it twice. Her great-aunt was dead, and her great-aunt had left her a tower with a clock in it, and a man she had never met meant to take £300 a year out of the bequest before she had so much as turned the key in the door. That was the whole of the news, and Honoria read it a third time before she trusted it. She was 28, slight, a little above middle height, with brown hair pinned plain and close, because loose hair and clockwork did not agree, and grey eyes that had the long steadiness of a person who spends her hours looking at small moving things until she understands them. Her hands were a tradesman's hands, kept to a lady's care, the nails short, a faint blue stain of clock oil at the right forefinger that no pumice ever quite lifted. She wore half mourning grey, for her father, the late watchmaker of the Skipton High Street, had been 3 years in the churchyard, and now she should wear black again for her great-aunt, and she felt the second loss settle on the first, the way a heavier weight settles on a lighter one already hung. The knock was Mrs. Sedber, who kept house for the lodging in which Honoria had 2 rooms and the use of the back kitchen for her bench. Mrs. Sedber put her head round the door and said that the post-boy from the Skipton solicitor was below and would wait for an answer, and that surely Miss Whitcliffe was not going to take on a great cold house on the moor with a clock the size of a cart in the top of it. A single woman of 28, when Mr. Bywell of Garsdale was a settled man of property who would buy out her interest and let her keep her bench in peace. Honoria set the verge spring down then, but gently, in its place on the green baize, because a sprung steel part flung down is a sprung steel part lost. The letter was from Mr. Joshua Skelton, solicitor, of Brigate in Leeds, and it told her 4 things in its first page: that her great-aunt, Mrs. Hester Ann Whitcliffe, widow of Whitcliffe Tower in the parish of Whitcliffe-le-Dale in Wharfdale, had died on the 9th of November last in her 76th year. That by a will proved at the Prerogative Court of York, Mrs. Whitcliffe had named her great-niece Honoria sole heiress of the Tower and its lands, that a gentleman of the neighbourhood had lodged a claim against the estate before the heiress had even been written to, and that Mr. Skelton would read the will to her at his chambers in Leeds on a day appointed, and counselled her to come. The 4th thing was the one Mrs. Sedber had not read, because Honoria had not shown it to her. A bond of annuity. A man named Hartus Bywell claimed that the late Mrs. Whitcliffe had signed, sealed and delivered to him a covenant promising him £300 a year out of the Tower rents for his life, and that she had done it at the foot of the bell turret stair on a particular evening, and that the great clock in the Tower had struck 6 as she set her hand to the paper, and that he could swear to the hour because the strokes had fallen one upon another over their 2 heads while the ink was wet. Honoria knew the clock. She had wound it as a girl. She knew the man not at all. She went to the small desk under the window, where she kept her father's tools and her own workbook, and she did not faint, and she did not weep, though Mrs. Sedber stood in the doorway, plainly braced to catch her at either. She took up a pen, and on the back of the second sheet she wrote 3 lines to Mr. Joshua Skelton of Brigate, Leeds, that she accepted the day he had named, the 3rd of December, that she would come up to Leeds by the Skipton coach the evening before, and that she begged he would have ready for her, against that morning, any letters or accounts of her great-aunts that touched the keeping and the repair of the Tower clock for as far back as his papers ran. She sealed it with a plain wafer and gave it to the post-boy at the foot of the stair, and went back up to her bench. The bracket clock lay open before her, its train scattered on the baize in the order she had taken it down. She did not take up the work again that night. She sat with the letter in her lap and the candle burning down, and she thought, not of the Tower and not of the £300, but of a thing her father had taught her at this same bench when she was 11 years old, that a clock cannot lie about the time, but a man can lie about a clock, and that the whole of their trade was knowing the difference. Mr. Joshua Skelton's chambers were in Briggate, 3 doors up from the Moot Hall, in a tall brick house with a brass plate worn bright by 40 years of thumbs. Honoria came to them on the morning of the 3rd of December, in her black, with her father's old green baize tool roll under her arm, which she had brought, though she could not have said why, except that a person carries to a hard place the thing her hands trust. Mr. Skelton was 63, spare, with iron spectacles and a dry, kind, careful manner. He had been the late Mrs. Whitcliffe's man of business 31 years. He received Honoria in the front chamber, where a coal fire burned against the December street, and where a long table had been laid with the will, an inventory, a schedule of the house and lands, and a dispatch box of japanned tin with the lid up. A clerk, a thin civil young man named Mr. Tyndall, stood at the table's foot with the ink and the wafers. Mr. Skelton seated Honoria at the table's side and took the head himself, and he said, before anything else, that he was sorry, that he had known her great-aunt long and respected her beyond the common run of his clients, and that the claim now lodged against her memory was a thing he meant to see answered to the bottom. Then he put on his iron spectacles and took up the will. "Your great-aunt asked," he said, "that I read it to you entire in her hearing, as she put it, though she is past hearing now. She set great store by a thing being read out plain. I will read it." He read it. Honoria sat with her gloved hands still in her lap and listened to her great-aunt's dispositions come one after another in the dry chamber air. It began in the old form, in the name of God, and gave the soul to God, and the body to the churchyard of St. Oswald's of Whitcliffe le Dale, to lie by the late Mr. Ambrose Whitcliffe, her husband under the south wall, with no more mourning at the parish than the parish custom. Then it came to the 2nd article, and the 2nd article was Honoria. Mr. Skelton read it slowly because it was long. To her great-niece Honoria Whitcliffe, only child of her late nephew Mr. Daniel Whitcliffe, watchmaker of Skipton, the testatrix gave the whole of it, the manor and tower of Whitcliffe, with the house adjoining, the 140 acres of dale pasture and the high-stinted moor-right on Whitcliffe Fell, the walled garden, the orchard of old Pear and Damson, the 4 cottages let to the tenants, the library of the house, the household plate, the sum of £2,400 in the public funds, and, set out by name, item by item, as a thing the testatrix would have her great-niece know was given on purpose and not by chance, the great turret clock in the bell tower, with its movement, its bells, its weights, its hand-cut going barrel and quarter barrel, and the long run of clock papers, rate books, and work bills kept in the muniment press from the year the clock was new, all to Honoria and her heirs forever. Honoria did not move while it was read, but something in her, hearing the clock named out in a court-proved will as a thing meant for her hands and no other, came as near to weeping as it had since the carrier brought the letter, and she mastered it, because there were men in the room. Then came the small bequests, and Mr. Skelton read each. To Mrs. Marjorie Dineley, housekeeper at Whitcliffe these 30 years, £100, and the small oak corner cupboard in the housekeeper's room, in thanks for her long keeping. To Mr. Abel Coverdale, butler at Whitcliffe these 28 years, £100, and the silver-mounted hunting horn in the hall, in thanks for his long and faithful service. To Mr. John Garnett, steward of the Whitcliffe lands these 22 years, £100, and the good bay cob in the stable, in thanks for the years he had given the land. To the Reverend Simeon Ingleby, curate of St. Oswald's these 11 years, £50, and the testatrix's quarto Bible of the year 1716, in thanks for his keeping of the parish. To Mr. Eli Sugden, clockmaker, of the Sheep Street in Skipton, the testatrix gave a ring of mourning and the sum of £20, in acknowledgment of his faithful keeping of my clock these many years, and of one good turn done me in my old age that he will remember, and I will not here set down. Honoria heard that, and marked it, and said nothing, because she did not yet know what it meant. The last article named Mr. Joshua Skelton sole executor, with the authority of the Court of York. There the will ended, and Mr. Skelton laid it on the table at Honoria's hand, and was quiet a moment. "That is the whole of it," he said. "A clean will, well drawn and well proved. There is no flaw in it that the law can find. I drew it myself, at this table on the 4th of June last, with your great-aunt in that chair you sit in, and 2 witnesses of my own clerks at the door." "Then the claim," Honoria said, in the level voice her father had bred in her at the bench. "The claim is not against the will." "No." Mr. Skelton took off his spectacles. "The claim does not touch the will. A bond stands beside a will, not against it. If a man holds a good bond charging an annuity on lands, then the lands come to you charged with that annuity, will or no will, and you must pay it out of your rents for the man's life or buy it up. The will gives you the tower. The bond, if it is good, gives Mr. Bywell £300 a year out of the tower until he dies. That is the shape of the trouble. It is not a quarrel about who owns the house. It is a quarrel about what the house already owes." He drew from the japanned box a single folded paper and did not yet open it. "He came to me," Mr. Skelton said, "on the 20th of November, 11 days after she died, and a fortnight before I had finished the inventory. He came with his attorney, a Mr. Pateley of the York Bar, a sharp man, and he laid before me a bond. I have a copy here. The original he keeps. I will tell you what it says, and then I will tell you what is wrong with it, for there is a great deal wrong with it, though not, I am sorry to say, anything that wrongness alone will throw out." He opened the copy and read it in his dry chamber voice, and Honoria listened to the second document of that morning as she had listened to the first. It was a bond of annuity in the common form. It recited that Hester Ann Whitcliffe, widow of Whitcliffe Tower, in consideration of long neighbourly kindness and of moneys formerly lent and never repaid, did bind herself, her heirs, and her lands of Whitcliffe, to pay unto Hartus Bywell, gentleman of Garsdale Head, the yearly sum of £300 for the term of his natural life, the first payment to fall at the Lady Day, next after the date of the bond. It was dated the 14th of October in the year 1822, 26 days before the testatrix died. It bore, the copy said, her name in her own hand, and her seal in red wax, and beneath, the names of 2 witnesses, one Reuben Bywell, the claimant's own brother, and one Mark Iveson, a Garsdale man, since, Mr. Skelton noted dryly, gone for a soldier and not to be found. "And the signing," Honoria said, "and the signing." Mr. Skelton set the paper down. "Here is the heart of it, Miss Whitcliffe, and you will see why I asked you to think hard before you took on the fight, for he has built it cunningly. Mr. Bywell does not say the bond was signed at my table, or before any man of law, or in any company that could be called to swear to it. He says it was signed at Whitcliffe Tower of an evening at the foot of the turret stair, with no soul present but himself, his brother, and Iveson, the witness who is conveniently across the sea. He fixes the day as the 14th of October, and he fixes the hour, and this is the thing he leans his whole weight upon. He fixes the hour by the clock. He swears the great clock in the tower struck 6 o'clock over their heads as your great-aunt set her hand to the bond, the 6 strokes falling slow while the wax was warm, and that the sound of it is fixed in his memory and his brother's beyond any shaking, For the bell of Whitcliffe is loud in the turret stair, and a man does not forget standing under it at the stroke. He folded the copy. He thinks it a strong proof, and a jury might think so too. A bond, a seal, 2 witnesses to the hand, and a circumstance, the striking of the hour, so particular, so homely, so unlikely to be invented, that it carries the ring of truth. Men believe a small, strange, true-sounding detail before they believe a great plain one. He has staked his claim on the chime of your clock. He could not know, for I did not know it myself until I went through your great-aunt's papers this last fortnight against your asking, that the chime of your clock is the very thing that will hang him. Honoria sat very still. "Tell me," she said. "I would rather you found it," said Mr. Skelton, "for you will find it surer than I can tell it, and you will have to stand up and say it yourself, in your own mouth, before him and his counsel, if it is to do any good. I will give you the papers. They are yours by the will in any case, the clock books, the rate books, the work bills. I have had Mr. Tyndall make a fair bundle of every leaf in the muniment press that bears upon the clock, from the year it was set up to the day she died. Take them to the Tower. Read them as a clockmaker's daughter reads them, which is a thing neither I nor Mr. Pateley nor any judge of York can do. And if what I think is in them, then write to me, and I will come up to Whitcliffe and stand at your shoulder when the man comes for his money." He gave the bundle into her hands across the table, a thick fold of papers tied in red tape, heavier than she had looked for, and with it, the keys. There were 5 on a ring of plain steel: the great house door, the muniment press, the plate chest, the library, and the smallest of them, a clean-cut steel key, dark with old oil, that Mr. Skelton said was the key of the clock chamber door in the Tower, the door at the head of the turret stair, behind which the movement stood. Honoria took the ring in her hand, and knew the small dark key before he named it by the feel of it, for it was a clock key's cousin, and her hand had known its like all her life. "There is one thing more," Mr. Skelton said, "that I am charged to give you, and that I do not understand, and that perhaps you will." He took from the box a second sealed paper, small, the wax stamped with the testatrix's own device, 3 pairs on a bend. "Your great-aunt left this in my keeping in the June, sealed with a direction in her own hand that it be given to her great-niece Honoria after the reading, and at no time before, and read by her alone. I have not opened it. I do not know what is in it. I give it you as she charged me." Honoria took it. It was light, a single sheet folded small. She did not open it in the chamber. She put it within her glove, against her wrist, and she finished the business of the morning, signed where Mr. Skelton showed her, took the inventory and the schedule, named the day she would go up to Whitcliffe, which was the 7th of December, and at noon she went down into Brigate again, with the keys at her waist, and the clock papers under her arm, and her father's tool-roll under the other. And she stood a moment in the cold Leeds street, among the carts and the criers, a clockmaker's daughter in black, who that morning had become the mistress of a tower and the defendant in a suit, and she did not yet feel the size of either. She put up that night at an inn in Brigate, and she did open the sealed paper then, alone, by a single candle, with the door barred. It was short, it was in her great-aunt's hand, an old woman's hand, upright and a little shaken, and it said this: "My dear Honoria, if you read this, I am gone, and Skelton has done as I bade him. I have left you the Tower, because you are the only one of my blood who will love the clock and not sell it, and because there is an old wrong in this family between me and your branch of it, that I was too proud and too late to mend in life, and that I will try to mend now with the only coin I have, which is the house. Do not let them tell you a single woman cannot keep a tower. I kept it 40 years a widow. There is a man will come with a paper and a lie about my clock. Trust the books. I kept the books for you all my life, though I did not know your name until your father wrote me 3 years gone. The clock will tell the truth if you ask it right. Your loving great-aunt, Hester Whitcliffe. Honoria read it twice, and then she folded it small again and held it in her 2 hands a long while. And the candle burned, and outside, the Leeds bells tolled 11 across the roofs, one tower answering another, and she listened to them as she had listened to bells all her life, and she thought that she had had a great aunt these 28 years, and had met her 4 times, and had not known until tonight that the old woman had loved her, and had been keeping books for her, against a need neither of them could have named, all that time. The 7th of December came in grey and still over Wharfdale, with a hard white rime on the dry stone walls and the river running low and dark under the ice at its edges. Honoria came up from Skipton in a hired 1-horse fly, north and west up the Dale Road, with the wharf on her left hand and the long brown wall of the fell rising on her right, 11 miles of frost-bound country with no change of horse, and the breath of the beast smoking before it, and she came at the close of the morning to the gates of Whitcliffe. The tower stood above the river on a shelf of the Dale side, and she saw it from half a mile off, as the road turned, a square grey peel tower of the old border kind, 4 stories of squared gritstone gone the colour of weathered iron, with a steep stone-flagged roof, and set in the south face below the parapet, the great pale dial of the clock, its single gilt hand black against the stone, and above the dial the louved bell stage where the bells hung. Joined to the foot of the tower, lower and later, was the dwelling-house, long and plain, 2 stories of the same grey stone under dark slate, with mullioned windows and a flagged porch, and smoke standing up straight from 3 chimneys into the windless cold. Behind it climbed the walled garden and the bare orchard, and beyond all of it the fell went up brown and immense to the white of the first snow on Whitcliffe top. Honoria looked at the great dial as the fly came up the drive, and the gilt hand stood at a little before noon, and she watched it the last 100 yards to see it move, as a clockmaker watches any strange clock, to read its rate from its face before she has touched it. It did not move. She came to the porch and got down and stood in the frosted gravel looking up, and the hand did not stir, and the hour of noon came and went by her own watch and her glove, and no bell struck from the louved stage, and the great clock of Whitcliffe Tower stood silent over her arrival as it had stood silent, though she did not yet know the number for many days. The house door opened, and an old butler came out onto the flags and bowed. This was Mr. Abel Coverdale, 28 years in the house, white-headed, straight-backed, in a sober dark coat, and he said in the broad, slow speech of the Dale that the tower was Miss Whitcliffe's, and welcome, and would she come in out of the cold. Behind him in the doorway stood the housekeeper, Mrs. Marjorie Dineley, 60 years old, in a black stuff gown and a white cap and a ring of keys at her waist that was the twin of the one now at Honoria's, and she curtsied and said the library fire had been in since dawn, and the south chamber aired 3 days against the coming, and at the steward's pace, coming round from the stable-yard with his hat in his hand, was Mr. John Garnett, weathered and square, 22 years on the land, who said the rent book and the accounts were on the library table whenever the new mistress chose to look at them, and at Mr. Garnett's heel, coming slow and stiff across the frosted flags, was an old grey deerhound with a white muzzle and clouded eyes, very tall and very gaunt with her age, who came to Honoria and put her long nose once into the new mistress's gloved hand, and stood there. Mr. Garnett said that the dog was Bracken, the late Mrs. Whitcliffe's own, who had lain at the tower door every night her mistress kept the clock, and who had eaten little and gone about less since the funeral, and would not be parted from the foot of the turret stair, where she lay now of nights, though there was neither fire nor company there. Honoria put her bare hand under the old dog's jaw and felt the grey muzzle, and said nothing, because the steward had told her in 3 plain sentences that the old woman who had loved her by letter had also been loved, in the dumb, faithful way of a house, by its butler and its housekeeper and its dog, and that was a thing that wanted no answer. She did not go first to her chamber, and she did not go first to the library and the rents. She asked Mr. Coverdale to bring her to the tower. He took a lantern from the porch, though it was day, for the stair was dark, and he led her through the house, through a flagged hall and a stone passage, to a low arched door in the thick wall where the dwelling met the tower, and he unlocked it, and there began the turret stair, a tight stone spiral worn-dished in the middle of every tread by 300 years of feet, winding up into the dark of the tower, with a rope for a handrail strung through iron rings. The old dog Bracken came to the foot of the stair and lay down on the cold flag there, her nose to the dark of the steps, and would not come up, and Honoria understood that this was the place the steward had meant, the foot of the turret stair, the very place where the bond was sworn to have been signed. She went up alone with the lantern, and told Mr. Coverdale she would call if she had need. She went up past the first door, which was the muniment room, and past the second, which gave onto the bell stage. And at the head of the stair, behind the third door, the small dark key in her hand, turning a clean, dry, well-kept lock, she came into the clock chamber. It was a square stone room under the leads, cold as a cellar, lit by one small north window and by her lantern, and in the middle of it, on a great oak frame bolted to the floor, stood the movement of the clock. Honoria stopped on the threshold and looked at it as another woman might have looked at a sleeping child, and she did not speak. It was a fine old turret movement, the iron and brass of it gone dark with age and oil, the going train on the right, the striking train on the left, the great barrels wound with their lines that ran down through holes in the floor to the weights in the shaft below, and rising from the centre, the long crutch and the heavy seconds-beating pendulum hanging down into the dark of the well beneath. The leads-off rod went up through the ceiling to the hand on the great south dial, and the bell cranks went off sideways through the wall to the hammers on the bell stage. She knew every part of it. She had wound a smaller cousin of it in this very tower as a girl of 9, lifted up to the window by her father's hands. And she saw, in the first long look, before she had crossed the floor, that the clock was not merely stopped. It was opened. It was under repair, and the repair was not finished. The going train was dismantled. The third wheel and the escape wheel were out of their places and lay wrapped in a cloth on the bench at the wall, and the pallets were off, and the great pendulum hung dead and still on a wire someone had slung to hold it out of the way. The striking train was locked, and the bell hammers were lifted off their tails and wedged up with little oak chocks so that the bell could not be struck even by hand. A clock so opened could not go. A clock so opened could not strike. It would stand on its dial at whatever hour the hand had been left, and send no stroke of any bell to any man standing below. On the bench, beside the wrapped wheels, weighted down by a brass winding key, lay a clockmaker's work-bill, half written, the ink long dry. Honoria set her lantern on the bench and read it where it lay, and it was in a craftsman's plain hand, and it was headed in the old way: Eli Sugden, clockmaker, Sheep Street, Skipton. To work done upon the turret clock at Whitcliffe Tower. And under it, the dated lines of a job begun and not yet billed as ended. She did not take the bill on trust. She put her thumbnail to the dust that had gathered in the empty seat where the escape wheel had stood, and found it lain even and undisturbed, the grey film of a chamber shut up for weeks and not for days. And she lifted one of the oak chocks from under a hammer-tail and turned it to the lantern, and saw that the bruise the steel had pressed into the soft wood was old and set, the raw look gone out of it, the way new wood greys where the iron has rested long. A man might swear to a date. Dust and pressed oak could not be coached. They told her, in the dumb sure way of a thing handled rather than said, that this stoppage was no fresh contrivance got up against the claim, but a true mischance, some weeks gone. She stood in the cold clock chamber with the half-written bill under her hand, and she understood the whole of it in one piece, the way she sometimes understood a sick clock the moment she had its dial off. She understood now why her great-aunt had written Trust the books, and why the will had thanked a clockmaker of Skipton for one good turn, done me in my old age that he will remember, and I will not here set down. Hartus Bywell had built his lie upon the one sound that could not have been made in this tower on the evening he had chosen, and the proof of it had been waiting here, in the iron and the ink, for a clockmaker to come and read it. She did not write to Mr. Skelton that night. She had a thing to do first that mattered more to her than the suit, and she went down and ate a little of the supper Mrs. Dineley had laid, and slept her first night under the slates of her own tower, and in the morning she began at the muniment press with the clock papers, because before she would fight the man, she would know her great-aunt's clock to the last tooth, and she would know it not from one half-written bill, but from the whole long, honest run of the books, so that when she stood up to speak, she would speak from the bottom and not the top. The muniment room was the first chamber off the stair, a small dry stone closet with a single iron-barred window, and, against the inner wall, the muniment press, a tall oak cupboard of many shallow drawers, each lettered on a bone tab in a hand that grew older as the years climbed. Honoria unlocked it on the morning of the 8th of December, and found that her great-aunt had kept the clock, as some women keep a journal, and others a household book, entirely, faithfully, and for nobody but herself, until now. There was a drawer for the rate books. There was a drawer for the work bills of the clockmakers, who had served the tower across 100 years. There was a drawer for the oil and the lines and the small accounts of weights recast and lines renewed. And there was the rate book in present use, a long, narrow, vellum-bound book in which Honoria saw at the first page every keeper of the clock since the year 1748 had set down, week by week, the going of it, the day, the error of the clock against the sun or against a good watch, the slow or the fast of it in seconds, and the hand that had corrected it. The last 70 years of the book were in 3 hands only. The middle third was her great-aunt's husband's, the late Mr. Ambrose Whitcliffe. The last 40 years were her great-aunt's own, week upon week, a widow climbing the tower every Sunday after church to take the rate of her clock against her watch and set it down. And the watch she had checked it against, named in the book 100 times, was a Daniel Whitcliffe watch, Honoria's own father's make, sold to the old lady out of the Skipton shop in a year before Honoria was born, so that for 40 years her great-aunt had been keeping the time of Whitcliffe Tower by a watch made by the hand of the nephew she had quarrelled with and never seen. Honoria sat with that a while before she went on. Then she came to the autumn of 1822, the last autumn, and she read it slow. The rate book ran clean and weekly all through the summer of that year, the clock keeping good time, a few seconds slow corrected each Sunday in the old woman's failing hand. Then at the last week of September, the entries changed. On the 29th of September, the old lady had written, "Not a rate, but a note. Clock stopped in the night. The scape wheel broke a tooth, the 3rd tooth from the collet, and the going train will not run. I am too old to mend it, and there is none in the Dale can. Sent to Skipton for Sugden. And after that, for week upon week, where the rates had been, there were no rates, because there was no going clock to rate, only a short line now and then in the old hand. Sugden came the 2nd of October, took down the going train. The wheel must go to Skipton to have a new tooth dovetailed in. He cannot get the brass before the back end. Clock stands. And under the 3rd of October, Sugden has lifted the hammers and chocked them, that the quarters strike not while the clock is open and the lad about the leads, for a half-struck quarter on a dead train will founder the whole. The tower is silent now. It is strange to live under a silent clock after 40 years. The Dale folk ask, is the old lady failing, that her clock is dumb. And under the 11th of October, Sugden cannot come again before Martinmas, the brass not yet to hand. The clock stands open and dumb. God keep the house. And then, 3 lines below that, the last clock entry her great-aunt ever made, dated the 30th of October. A fortnight after the day, Hartass Bywell swore the bell had struck 6 over the signing of his bond, and 10 days before she died. The clock stands silent yet. Sugden writes he will come at Martinmas with the mended wheel. I shall not perhaps hear it strike again, for I am very tired this back end. But it will strike for the next who keeps it. I have set all the books in order in the press against that hand. H.W. Honoria closed the rate book and sat in the cold muniment room with her great-aunt's last clock words under her hand, and the thing was as plain now from the books as it had been from the iron. On the 14th of October, in the year 1822, the clock could not, on that evening or any evening of that whole month, have struck a single note of any hour, for the iron showed it dismantled. And now, the books dated the dismantling to a fortnight before. The one circumstance on which Hartass Bywell had staked his whole claim, the slow falling of 6 strokes while the wax cooled, was the one circumstance that the clock itself, and the clock's keeper, and the clock's mender all said in 3 voices, could not have happened. She had 3 witnesses then, and she counted them over as her father had taught her to count the proofs of a thing before she trusted her life to it. The first was the iron of the clock, which she had seen with her own eyes, and which Mr. Skelton and his clerk and any honest man might be brought up the stair to see. The going train down, the wheels wrapped on the bench, the hammers chocked, but iron could be argued. A sharp counsel like Mr. Pateley would say the clock was opened later, after the day in question, and that on the night in question it had been whole and striking, and who was to swear to the day a wheel came out? Iron alone would not hang him. The second was the rate book, in her great-aunt's own hand, dated week by week through the very month, naming the broken tooth on the 29th of September, and the chocking of the hammers on the 3rd of October, and the silent tower on the 11th and the 30th. That was better, for it was set down from week to week, as the thing befell, by a woman who could not have foreseen that a man would one day swear a bell had struck. But it too might be argued, for it was the dead woman's own book, and Mr. Pateley would say a woman's private memorandum is no evidence, and that the entries might have been written all at one sitting, or written false, or written by another hand. The third was the man himself, Eli Sugden, clockmaker, of the Sheep Street in Skipton, living and within 10 miles, who had taken the going train down with his own hands on the 2nd of October, and lifted the hammers on the 3rd, and whose half-written work-bill lay on the clock-chamber bench, and who could come into a room and swear, on his own oath as a craftsman of 40 years' name in the trade, that the clock was open and dumb in his keeping on the 14th of October, and that he would stake his living on it. A living man's oath, backed by his own dated bill and the broken wheel he had carried away and could produce, was a thing no jury would set aside for the unsupported word of a claimant and his own brother. That was the proof that would finish it. The iron showed it. The book dated it. The man swore it. 3 voices, and they did not disagree by so much as a day. Honoria saw, sitting there, that her great-aunt had built this defence for her without knowing she would need it, had broken a tooth by the common chance of an old clock wearing out, had sent for the right honest man, had kept her book as she always kept it, and had left a clue in the will, £20 and a ring to Eli Sugden, for a good turn she would not name, so that whoever came after should know which man to call. And she saw, too, that the building was not yet finished, for proofs are like clockwork. Every wheel must mesh, and a single tooth out of true will stop the whole. She must have Eli Sugden's word in his own mouth, and his bill made out fair, and his broken wheel produced. She must have Mr. Skelton up to see the iron and certify it. She must have the rate book, proved as her great-aunt's hand by men who knew the hand. And she must do all of it quietly, and in order, before Hartus Bywell and his Mr. Pateley came up the dale for their Lady Day money, so that when they came, the case should be already standing built, and want only to be shown. She went down from the tower at noon, and wrote her first letter, and it was not to Mr. Skelton. It was to Mr. Eli Sugden, clockmaker, in the plain trade hand her father had taught her, one craftsman's child to an old craftsman, asking him to do her the kindness of coming up to Whitcliffe at his own first convenience to finish the work upon the turret clock that he had begun for her late great-aunt in the October, and to bring with him the mended scape-wheel and his book of the work, for she was a watchmaker's daughter herself, and would be glad to take the clock in hand with him, and to settle his bill in full. She said nothing in the letter of the suit, or of the bond, or of that October evening. She would say that to his face. A thing of that weight is not put in a letter that a post-boy may drop in a ditch. She sealed it, and gave it to Mr. Garnett to send down by the next carrier, and then she did the second thing, which was to take up at last the rent book and the steward's accounts and the schedule of the lands, for she was the mistress of the place now as well as its defendant, and a tower that owed a man £300 a year, if it came to that, must know to a shilling what it had coming in. She sat with Mr. Garnett at the library table through the short afternoon, and learned her own estate, the dale pasture, the high-stinted grazing on the fell, 80 gates of moor for the sheep, the 4 cottages let to the tenants, the Pickards, the Lambs, old widow constable, and the tenants of the mill cottage, the orchard and the garden, the whole of it bringing in, clear of the land tax and the parish rates and the small outgoings of the house, something near £410 a year, from which, if Hartus Bywell had his way, £300 a year would go out to Garsdale Head for the rest of his natural life, and leave the mistress of the tower £110 a year to keep a great house, 4 servants, an old dog, and a 300-year-old clock. The bond would not take her house. It would only make it impossible to live in. That, she saw, was the whole of his cunning. He did not want the tower, which he could not have under the will. He wanted to bleed it until the new mistress, a single woman with a trade of her own to go back to, gave up the unequal struggle and sold him her interest for a song, and went back to her bench in Skipton and let Garsdale have the dale. It was a patient, bloodless, neighbourly sort of robbery, and it would have worked on a woman who did not know clocks. In the evening, Mrs. Dingley brought into the library, after the supper was cleared, a small calf-bound book tied with a black ribbon, and set it at Honoria's elbow with a curtsy, and said in her quiet way that it was the late mistress's own book, her commonplace book, that she had kept by her these many years, and that she had laid it by in the housekeeper's room against the new mistress's coming, for it seemed to her a thing for Miss Whitcliffe and no other. Honoria thanked her and untied the ribbon, and that night, by the library fire, she began to read it, and so began to learn, not the clock, which the rate books had taught her, but the woman, which only this could. It was a plain book, not a diary of days, but a gathering of whatever the old lady had cared to set down across 40 years. A receipt for a cordial, a verse copied out, the date of a hard winter, the price of wool in a good year and a bad. But threaded all through it, growing as the years climbed, was the clock. Set the clock by the noon mark this day, the sun on the south jamb at 12. The east bell cracked in the frost, and is recast at Mr. Whitehead's of York, a sweeter note than the old. Ambrose dead this day. I shall keep his clock for him as long as I am able, and after. And later, in the failing hand of the last years, the entries that made Honoria set the book down and look into the fire. I have written this day to my nephew Daniel Whitcliffe in Skipton, whom I have not spoken to these 30 years for a hard old reason that was as much my fault as his father's, to ask after his child. It is a great while to be too proud to write one letter. And under another year, Daniel is dead. I never saw him grown. He has left a daughter, Honoria, a watchmaker like himself, 28 and unmarried and keeping his shop. A watchmaker. Of all the trades in England, the one I would have chosen for the hand that comes after me at this tower. I will not write to her yet. I am ashamed to come to her only when I am old and want an heir. But I will set my house in order for her, and leave her the clock, and let the clock speak for me when I cannot. Honoria closed the book at that and sat a long time, and the library fire fell in, and somewhere over her head in the cold tower the silent clock stood with its broken tooth and its lifted hammers, and she thought that she had come up to Whitcliffe in 3 days, expecting a cold house and a hard fight, and had found instead an old woman's 40-year apology, written in a book of rates and a book of common things, addressed to a great niece she was too proud to write to in life, and too honest not to provide for in death. The fight she would make, but the fight she saw now, was not the thing. The thing was the apology, and the answer to it, and the only answer she could make to a dead woman was to keep the clock, and not sell it, and not let the man from Garsdale have the dale. And so she would. Bracken had come into the library and lain down at the hearth, the first time she had left her post at the foot of the steps, and Honoria put her hand down to the grey head, and the dog leaned its weight against her chair, and the two of them kept the fire between them late into the first long night of the new mistress's keeping. Eli Sugden came up the dale on the 11th of December, in his own cart, an old man of 70 with a brown, weathered face and quick, clean hands and a leather apron rolled under the seat and a small deal box on his knees that he would let no other hand carry. Honoria met him at the porch, and knew him for what he was before he spoke, by the box and the hands, as he knew her. And they stood a moment on the flags taking each other's measure, the old clockmaker and the young one. And then he said, in the flat, craven speech, that he had known her father, and bought movements off him 40 years, and that Dan Whitcliffe's lass would do to take a clock down with, and that was as near a courtesy as Eli Sugden came. She took him up the turret stair to the clock chamber, and he set his box on the bench beside his own half-written bill, and opened it, and lifted out, wrapped in a square of green baize, the scape wheel, with its new tooth dovetailed in bright against the old dark brass, filed and polished and true. He set it in her hand, without a word, and watched her turn it to the light, and run her thumbnail down the new tooth to feel the joint, and when she nodded, he gave the short nod back, and that was the whole of their agreement that the work was good. They worked the day together on the clock, and Honoria did not speak of the suit until the light began to go. They set the mended scape wheel back on its arbor, and trued the depth of it into the third wheel, and repinned the pallets, and let the dead pendulum down off its wire and set it swinging, and oiled the train sparing and clean at every pivot, the way her father had taught her and his father had taught him. And at the last, Eli Sugden knocked out the little oak chocks from under the bell hammers one by one, and let the hammers down soft onto their tails, and stood back. He set the hands, he let the train into beat. And the great clock of Whitcliffe Tower, that had stood silent 40 days, began to go. the slow, heavy seconds beat of the pendulum coming up through the floor, the soft click of the scape wheel passing tooth by tooth, the whole old iron and brass of it waking under their hands. And Honoria stood in the cold chamber and heard her great-aunt's clock begin again, and her eyes stung, and she did not let it come, because Eli Sugden was there. But she put her hand flat on the oak frame and felt the beat come up into her palm. Then the hour came round, and the going train released the strike, and the train ran, and the hammer lifted and fell, and the great bell over their heads spoke, once, twice, onto the full count, the deep note rolling out from the louved stage over the whole white dale, the first stroke of Whitcliffe in 40 days, and far below, in the dark of the stairwell, the old dog Bracken lifted up her grey head and gave one long cry to the sound of the bell she had not heard since her mistress died, and then was quiet. When the bell had done, in the ringing afterward, Honoria said, "Mr. Sugden, I must tell you a thing, and then I must ask you a thing, and you may say no to the asking, and be no worse my friend." And she told him of Harter's Bywell, and the bond, and the £300 a year, and the evening of the 14th of October, and the 6 strokes the man swore had fallen over the wet wax while he stood with her great-aunt at the foot of this stair. She told it plain, in order, and the old man listened with his clean hands still on the bench, and his brown face going hard, and when she had done he was quiet a moment, and then he said one word, which was a craven word, and not a parlour word, and then he begged her pardon for it. "The 14th of October, he said, "I took yon going train down with these hands on the 2nd. The wheel was in my shop in Skipton the whole back end, on my own bench, under my own eye, with the new tooth not yet cut. I chocked them hammers up myself on the 3rd, and I'll tell you for why. That a half-struck quarter on a dead train fetches the count out, and you're a day mending it. That bell could no more have struck 6 that night than I could have flown up to it. There was no clock here to strike. There was a frame of iron with the heart out of it, and the wheel 10 mile off in Skipton in a box. I'll swear it on out you like, miss. I'll swear it in York before the judges. I've a name in this trade 40 years, and yon man'll not steal a dead woman's house with a lie about a bell, while Eli Sugden's wick." He made out his bill fare that evening at the library table, dated and itemised from the 2nd of October to the 11th of December, the taking down and the carriage and the new tooth and the setting up. And he wrote at the foot of it, in his own hand, at Honoria's asking and Mr. Coverdale's witnessing, a plain sworn note that the going train of the clock had been dismantled and in his keeping at Skipton, and the bell hammers lifted and chocked by him continuously from the 2nd of October to this 11th of December, and that no part of the clock could have struck any hour in all that time. He signed it, Eli Sugden, his mark a clean tradesman's signature, and Mr. Coverdale set his name under as witness, and Honoria locked the bill and the note in the muniment press with the rate books, and now she had her 3rd witness in writing as well as in his living mouth, and the case was very near built. She had the broken-off tooth too, for Eli Sugden took it out of a screw of paper in his waistcoat pocket and gave it her, the old broken 3rd tooth, snapped clean across, that he had kept, as old craftsmen keep such things, and Honoria laid it in a little box, with a written label, and put it in the press. A small thing of brass, no bigger than a barleycorn, that was, she thought, the truest witness of them all, for it was the very accident that had silenced the clock, and it could not be argued with. That same week she wrote at last to Mr. Skelton in Leeds, and told him all of it. The clock found open, the rate book's entries through the month, Eli Sugden come and sworn, the bill and the note and the broken tooth in the press, and asked him to come up to Whitcliffe before Lady Day to see the iron with his own eyes while it was fresh in his memory, and to advise her how the man should best be met, in the open court at York, or at the Tower, across a table, before council, where the proofs could be laid down one upon another, in their own place under the very clock they spoke of. Mr. Skelton wrote back by return that he would come the second week of January, and that for his own part he thought the Tower the better ground, for a clock is a thing better shown than described, and a jury at York would have only words, but a man brought up the turret stair to stand under the bell and see the place would have the truth in his eyes, and that he would write to Mr. Pateley and propose a meeting at Whitcliffe in the new year, before any of it went to the court, and let Hartass Bywell come and look at what he had sworn against. So the shape of the thing was set. There should be an interview at the Tower in the new year, before the proofs were carried to York, and Honoria, who had come up the dale a defendant with nothing but a hard letter, would stand on her own ground with 3 witnesses built into a case and a great clock going again over her head, and wait for the man from Garsdale to come and unsay what he had sworn. It was in the keeping of the clock, in those short December days, that she first met Sir Lewis Aldborough, and she met him over a bell, which was the only way she could have met him and cared. The east bell of Whitcliffe, the smaller of the two, had taken a flat, sour note when Eli Sugden set the clock going. A bell will go false with age and weather as a clock will. And Mr. Coverdale said the old mistress had spoken in her last year of having it looked to, and had named the gentleman who looked to such things in that country, who was Sir Lewis Aldborough of Aldborough Court, 10 miles east over the moor, a baronet who had made the founding and tuning of bells his study, and who had hung new rings in half the towers of the West Riding at his own charge for the love of the art. Honoria wrote to him, a plain civil note, as one keeper of a tower to a man who understood bells, asking whether he would advise her on the sour east bell of Whitcliffe at his convenience, and naming herself the new mistress and a watchmaker's daughter, that he might know she would understand what he told her. He came himself, within the week, on a raw morning before Christmas, riding over the moor with a single servant, and Honoria, who had looked for an elderly virtuoso, found a man of 42, tall and spare and weathered, with dark hair going grey at the temple, and steady grey eyes and a quiet grave way of speaking, in a plain riding coat with no more of the baronet about him than a good seal ring. A widower, she learned before the morning was out, these 5 years, with one child, a small daughter, and a great empty house full of bells he tuned and pipes he voiced, and no one to play them to. He went up the tower with her, and stood on the bell stage under the 2 great bells in the cold, and laid his bare hand flat on the bronze of the sour east bell, and struck it soft with a little hammer he carried, and listened with his head down and his eyes shut, the way a clockmaker listens to a train, and named the fault. The bell gone thin at the sound bow, a hair of metal to come off the inside with the file to bring the note home, before he had struck it twice, and Honoria, watching him listen, knew that she was watching a man do to a bell exactly what she did to a clock, and the recognition went through her like a key, turning in a lock that has waited a long time to be turned. They talked the whole of that morning, on the bell stage and after by the library fire, and it was all of bells and clocks, and the keeping of old work, and neither of them said one word that a chaperone could have caught at. And yet by the time he rode back over the moor in the early dark, Honoria knew that something had begun, in the plain grave country way, that had not begun for her in 28 years at a bench, and she did not name it even to herself, but she went up to the clock that night before she slept, and stood in the cold chamber with the great pendulum swinging its slow, heavy beat in the dark, and her hand on the frame, and she was glad, for the first time since the carrier brought the letter, with a gladness that had nothing to do with the suit. Sir Lewis came again after Christmas, with his file and his small tools, and took the hair of metal off the inside of the sour bell, the 2 of them on the bell stage a whole short day in the cold. And at the end of it, he struck the east bell, and it spoke true. The the flat sourness gone, the note come home sweet and clear over the dale, and they stood on the stage and listened to it ring out into the white afternoon, and he said, in his grave, quiet way, that it was the best note in the dale now. And Honoria said that her great-aunt would have been glad of it. And he said that he had known her great-aunt a little, and had thought her the only soul in that country who cared for such things as he cared for them, and was sorry she was gone. And then he looked at Honoria a moment, plainly, and said that he was less sorry than he had been a fortnight since, for the caring had not died with the old lady after all. And Honoria felt the colour come up in her face for the first time since girlhood, and turned it to the bell, and did not answer, but she did not mind that he had said it. He brought his daughter the third time, a small grave child of 9 named Phoebe, who had her father's steady eyes and a passion, it turned out, for the going of clocks. And Honoria took the child up to the clock chamber with Mrs. Dineley 3 steps behind for the propriety of it, and showed her the great movement going in its chamber, the slow swing of the pendulum and the turning of the wheels, and let her stand on the window and feel the strike let off and the hammer fall and the bell speak over her head. And the child stood transfixed with her 2 hands on the frame, exactly as Honoria had stood at her age, and said that it was the best thing she had ever seen, better than the bells even. And might she come again and learn the wheels? And Honoria, looking from the child to the father, where he stood quiet in the chamber door, watching the 2 of them, felt the shape of a thing she had never let herself imagine, settle gently over the cold stone room. And she said that the child might come whenever she chose, and the matter was, in some way, none of the 3 of them spoke, settled. Mr. Skelton came up to Whitcliffe on the 10th of January in the Leeds chaise with his clerk, Mr. Tyndall, and a fair copy book and a travelling inkstand, and he went up the turret stair the same hour he arrived, before he would so much as take his dinner, and stood in the clock chamber and looked at the going clock, and had Honoria show him, step by step, what had been broken and what mended, and then he had her show him the rate book and the work bill, and the sworn note, and the broken tooth in its labelled box, and he went through them at the library table the whole of that afternoon, with the care of 31 years' practice, and at the end of it he took off his iron spectacles and looked at Honoria across the papers, and said that in 31 years he had not seen a claim so cleanly answered, nor a defence a dead woman had built so well for a great niece she had never met, and that the meeting with Mr. Pateley was set for the 17th at the Tower, in this room, and that Harter's Bywell and his council were coming, and that Honoria should lay the 3 proofs herself, in her own mouth, in order, for it was her clock and her great-aunt and her tower, and the truth would come better from the hand that kept the clock than from any lawyer's, and that he would sit beside her and see fair play, and that she had nothing to fear that the truth did not cover. The 17th of January came in hard and bright, with a blue frost on the dale, and the fell white to the top, and the river loud under the ice, and the great clock of Whitcliffe going steady over the house and striking its hours clear across the frozen dale, every stroke a small witness in itself, though none in that house but Honoria yet thought of it so. She was at the library table since early, in her black, the rate book and the work bill and the sworn note and the little labelled box of the broken tooth set out before her in the order she would take them, the commonplace book closed at her right hand, her father's tool roll, for no reason she could have given except that it steadied her, on the chair at her side. Mr. Skelton sat at the table's head with his spectacles and his chamber's ledger. Mr. Tyndall sat at the foot, with the ink to take the record. The Reverend Ingleby, the parish curate, sat on the long oak settle by the fire, for Mr. Skelton had asked him as a witness of standing in the dale. Mr. Coverdale stood at the door. And up in the cold of the tower, oiled and going, the clock kept the time of the meeting. The carriage from Garsdale came up the drive at 10:30. Honoria heard the wheels on the frozen gravel and did not lift her head from the rate book. Mr. Coverdale went out and came back and announced in his slow, grave manner, Mr. Hartus Bywell of Garsdale Head and Mr. Pateley of the York Bar. Hartus Bywell came in first. He was a big man of 55, heavy and high-coloured, in a good blue coat and a yellow waistcoat, with a loud, confident, neighbourly manner and small, quick eyes that went round the room and counted the company and were not quite so easy after they had counted it as before. Behind him came Mr. Pateley, thin and grey and dry, with a green bag under his arm, a man who had plainly read the case as a strong one and come up the dale expecting a frightened single woman, and was now, by the look of the table laid with books, revising his expectation tooth by tooth. They were seated opposite Honoria and Mr. Skelton, and Mr. Bywell gave Honoria a large, genial nod, the nod a man of property gives a young woman he means to be reasonable with before he ruins her, and said it was a cold ride over, and a sad business to trouble her so soon in her mourning, but business was business, and the sooner settled the kinder to all. Mr. Skelton let him finish, and then said, dry and level, Mr. Pateley, we are met, before any of this goes to York, that your client may set out his claim, and that Miss Whitcliffe may answer it, here, under the clock that is named in it. You will set out the bond. Mr. Pateley set it out. He took the original bond from his green bag and read it. The recital of neighbourly kindness and moneys lent, the £300 a year for Hartus Bywell's life, charged on the lands of Whitcliffe, the date of the 14th of October, the testatrix's name and seal, the two witnesses, the brother Reuben and the absent Iveson. And then, because it was the strength of his case and he knew it, he came to the signing, and he made the most of it in his dry court voice, watching Honoria the while to see her flinch. The bond was signed, he said, of an evening on the 14th of October last, at the foot of the turret stair, within this very tower, my client and his brother attending the late Mrs. Whitcliffe, and the witness Iveson by. My client will swear, and his brother will swear, that as Mrs. Whitcliffe set her hand and seal to the bond, the great clock above them struck the hour of 6, the 6 strokes falling slow and loud down the turret stair over their heads, while the wax was yet warm under her seal. It is a thing, gentlemen, that no man invents and no man forgets, to stand at the foot of that stair, under that bell, at the stroke of the hour. My client has carried the sound of it in his ears these 3 months. It fixes the day, the hour, and the place beyond any cavil. I am content to rest the whole authenticity of this bond upon it. If Mrs. Whitcliffe signed this bond, she signed it to the striking of her own clock, and my client heard it. And that is the truth of the 14th of October. He sat back. Hartus Bywell folded his big hands on the table, with the satisfied air of a man who has heard his strong card played well, and looked at Honoria, and said, in his loud, genial way, "It's a hard thing to gainsay, Miss Whitcliffe. A man knows what he heard. I stood there. The clock struck 6. I'd take my oath on it before God and the judges of York, and so would my brother. You'd do better, lass, to let me buy your interest, and we'll say no more, than to fight a thing you cannot shift." Honoria lifted her head from the rate book then, and looked at him, and spoke for the first time in the plain, steady voice her father had bred in her at the bench, that asked and answered the price of things straight. "Mr. Bywell, I beg the leave of this meeting to set out 3 matters at this table, and to ask you to look at each before you sign Mr. Pateley's paper. Mr. Skelton, may I have the leave of the meeting?" Mr. Skelton gave the small nod. "You have the leave, Miss Whitcliffe." She laid her hand on the rate book. "The first matter is my great-aunt's rate book of this clock. Every keeper of the clock, since the year 1748, has set down in it, week by week, the going of the clock and the mending of it, the day, the error, The slow or the fast, the hand that corrected it. The last 40 years are in my great-aunt's own hand, every Sunday after church, a widow climbing the stair to take the rate of her clock against her watch. Mr. Skelton has examined the book and will speak to the hand. "It is her hand," said Mr. Skelton. "I knew it 31 years. I have compared it this week, leaf by leaf, with letters of hers in my own keeping. It is her hand throughout, and the ink and the wear of the leaves are of their dates. I will swear to it. Mr. Bywell," Honoria said, "I will read you what my great-aunt wrote in this book in the autumn of last year, not after your bond, for she could not have known of your bond, but week by week as the thing befell, in the ordinary keeping of her clock." And she read it, slow and plain, turning the leaves, the 29th of September. The scape wheel broke a tooth, the third tooth from the collet. The going train will not run, sent to Skipton for Sugden. The 2nd of October, Sugden came, took down the going train. The wheel must go to Skipton. The 3rd of October, Sugden has lifted the hammers and chocked them. The tower is silent now. It is strange to live under a silent clock after 40 years. The 11th of October, the clock stands open and dumb. And the 30th of October, 16 days after the night of the bond, 10 days before she died, the clock stands silent yet. I shall not perhaps hear it strike again, but it will strike for the next who keeps it. She closed the book and looked at him. On the 14th of October, Mr. Bywell, by my great-aunt's own hand, set down from week to week. The clock of this tower had its going train in pieces and its bell hammers lifted off and wedged with oak, and the tower was silent and had been silent since the 3rd of the month, and stood silent for a fortnight after. There was no clock to strike 6. There was no bell that could be struck. Hartas Bywell's small eyes moved, but his big, easy manner held. "A private book," he said. "A dead woman's scribble. Who's to say when it was written, or by what hand, or whether the old lady muddled her dates, failing as she was? Mr. Pateley?" "It is a point," said Mr. Pateley, dry, but he was watching the books now, and not Honoria. "A private memorandum is weak evidence, Miss Whitcliffe, and the more so from a person in failing health. The book alone will not answer." "Then I come to the second matter," Honoria said, "which is not a book." She took up the little labelled box and opened it and set on the table, on its square of paper, the broken brass tooth, no bigger than a barley corn. "This is the tooth that broke. The third tooth of the scape wheel, snapped clean across, that stopped the clock on the 29th of September. It was kept by the clockmaker who took it out and given to me, and I've had it under my own eye since. And the clock above us, gentlemen, will show you the wheel it came out of, with the new tooth bright against the old where it was mended, and the bench above us holds the chocks that wedged the hammers, and the whole of the iron of it is there to be seen by any man who will climb the stair. A clock with its scape wheel out, and its hammers chocked, cannot go and cannot strike. That is not law, nor a dead woman's hand. That is iron. And any man here may go up and put his own hand on it." "Iron," said Mr. Pateley, recovering a little, "may be opened at any time. Who is to swear the wheel came out before the 14th and not after? The clock goes now. Perhaps it went then, and was opened since, for this very purpose. The iron shows a clock opened. It does not show the day." "No," Honoria said, "the iron does not show the day. And so I come to the third matter which does." She set her hand on the work bill and the sworn note. "The third matter is the clockmaker himself, Mr. Eli Sugden, of the Sheep Street in Skipton, a master of his trade these 40 years, living, and 10 miles from this room. He took the going train of this clock down with his own hands on the 2nd of October. He carried the broken wheel to his own shop in Skipton, where it lay on his own bench, under his own eye, the whole of the back end, the new tooth not cut until December. He lifted the hammers and chalked them on the 3rd of October with his own hands. Here is his bill, dated and itemized from the 2nd of October to the 11th of December. Every day's work set down. And here, under it, is his note, written and signed at this table in my butler's witness, sworn in his own hand, that the going train of this clock was dismantled and in his keeping at Skipton, and the bell hammers lifted and chalked by him, continuously from the 2nd of October to the 11th of December, and that no part of the clock could have struck any hour in all that time. He has told me to my face, and bids me tell this meeting, that he will swear it on his oath in York before the judges, that the clock could no more have struck 6 on the 14th of October than he could have flown up to the bell, and that he has a name in his trade these 40 years, and will not see a dead woman's house stolen with a lie about a bell while he is living to speak. The room was very quiet. Up in the tower, faint through the stone, the going clock ticked its slow seconds beat over the meeting. Mr. Bywell, Honoria said, and she did not raise her voice. Your claim rests on the striking of the clock. The striking of the clock rests on the clock being whole and going that night. But the clock was broken on the 29th of September, a fortnight before, and taken down on the 2nd of October, and silenced on the 3rd, by a master clockmaker who will swear to every day of it, and whose wheel lay on his own bench in Skipton the whole of that month, and whose broken tooth lies here on this table, and whose work my great-aunt set down week by week in a book Mr. Skelton will swear is her hand. There was no stroke of 6. There was no bell. There was a frame of cold iron with the heart taken out of it, and a silent tower, and a tired old woman writing in her book that it was strange to live under a clock that did not speak. Whatever was signed at the foot of that stair on the 14th of October, if anything was, it was not signed to the striking of this clock, for this clock did not strike, that night or any night of that month. The bond cannot stand on the bell. There was no bell. She did not say more. She set her hands quiet on the table, on her great-aunt's books, and waited, and the clock ticked overhead, and nobody in the room looked at Hartas Bywell except Honoria, who did. The big high colour had gone out of his face from the jaw up, leaving it ashen under the redness. His small eyes had stopped moving. He looked at the broken tooth on its square of paper, and at the rate book under Honoria's hand, and at the sworn note with Eli Sugden's name to it, and at Mr. Pateley beside him, and Mr. Pateley would not meet his eye but was already reaching, quietly, to draw the bond back across the table into his green bag. And Hartas Bywell, who had come up the dale to bleed a tower white with a lie about a bell, sat with his big hands loose on the table and the truth of it plain on his grey face, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Then he did the one thing the whole long building of the case had been for, and he did it on his own, before his counsel could stop him, in the loud, broken voice of a big, confident man, whose confidence has gone out from under him all at once. There was no clock, he said. He was not looking at Honoria. He was looking at the rate book. I'd not thought of the books. I'd not thought she'd write it down. Week on week, an old woman, her clock stopped. I'd reckoned on no soul knowing it was opened. I'd reckoned the bell would carry it. He stopped, and his big hand went flat on the table, and he said, "Lo, the thing that ended it. You're right, lass. There was no bell that night. The clock was dumb. I knew it was dumb. God forgive me, I knew it the while." It was as much as any man could say, and more than his counsel wished him to, and the room let it fall into silence. Mr. Pateley rose and tied his green bag, and bowed stiffly to Mr. Skelton across the table. "Mr. Skelton, the claim of my client is withdrawn at this meeting. The bond of the 14th of October is withdrawn. I shall not carry it to York. I beg the leave of the meeting to retire." Mr. Skelton rose and gave the bow back. "Mr. Pateley, the withdrawal is noted, and Mr. Tyndall has it in the record, and I shall lodge a note of it at York that the claim is at an end, and the lands of Whitcliffe clear of it. The meeting is closed." He looked at Hartus Bywell a moment, not unkindly, for he was an old man and had seen many ruined claims, and said only, "You will go home, Mr. Bywell, and let the Dale alone. A bond raised on a lie is a felony, and Miss Whitcliffe might carry this further than York if she chose. She does not choose. Be content with that, and trouble her no more." Hartus Bywell rose, heavy and grey, and old-looking now, and he did not look at the books, and he did not look at Mr. Pateley, but he looked at Honoria once, plainly, and he said, "I'll not trouble you, miss. You've your great-aunt's hand and her clock, and an honest man's oath, and I've a lie and a brother that'll thank me for none of this. She built better than I reckoned, the old lady. She built for you." And he bowed, a heavy, awkward bow, and went out, and Mr. Coverdale held the door, and the carriage wheels turned on the frozen gravel and went away down the dale, and the great clock of Whitcliffe, going steady overhead, struck 11 across the white country, as if it had never in its 300 years stood silent for any man. When they were gone, and the record signed, Mr. Skelton put up his spectacles and looked at Honoria across the table where the 3 proofs lay, and said that it was the cleanest hour's work he had seen in a long practice, and that her great-aunt would have been glad. And Honoria, who had not let it come all that hard morning, sat with her hand on the rate-book and her great-aunt's 40-year hand under it, and let it come a little at last, quietly, with only the old solicitor and the parish curate and the going of the clock to see, for the thing that was settled at that table was not the £300, and was not even the tower, but an old wrong between 2 branches of a family that a dead woman had reached out of her grave to mend with a clock, and that her great-niece, by keeping the clock and standing up for it, had taken into her own hands and made good. She went up to the clock chamber that evening alone, when the house was quiet, and stood in the cold with the great pendulum swinging its slow beat in the dark, and the wheels turning and the weights going down, and she put her hand flat on the oak frame, and felt the heart of it beat up into her palm, and she said aloud to the empty chamber, which she had not done before, and never told a soul she had done, "It is settled, aunt. The clock kept the truth. I have the tower, and I shall not sell it, and Garsdale shall not have the Dale." And the clock ticked on, tooth by tooth, the only answer it had, and it was answer enough, and far below, where she had kept her long watch, the old dog Bracken, who had her bell back, slept easy by the warm kitchen wall for the first night since her mistress died, and did not keep the cold stare any more. The winter went over into the early Wharfdale spring, and the new mistress of Whitcliffe settled into the keeping of her tower in a way that surprised the Dale and did not surprise her, for she had kept her father's shop alone 28 years, and knew how to be the steady centre of a place. She kept the clock herself, every Sunday after church, up the turret stair, with the rate-book and her father's watch, the very watch her great-aunt had timed the tower by for 40 years, which Mr. Skelton found among the old lady's things and gave to Honoria, so that the watch came home to the maker's daughter at last. And she set down the going of the clock in the book in her own hand under her great-aunt's, the first new hand in the rate-book in 40 years, and the long faithful record ran on unbroken into another keeping. She learned the rest of the old wrong by degrees, and most of it from the Reverend Ingleby, who had it from the old lady's own lips in her last year. It was a plain, hard family thing of the kind that sunders branches for a lifetime over a matter that looks small from outside and is not small from within. Her great-aunt Hester had been a Whitcliffe by marriage, and a proud woman, and Honoria's grandfather, Hester's husband's younger brother, had married beneath the family's notion of itself, a clockmaker's widow, and had been cut off for it. And when Honoria's father Daniel was born into the lesser branch and bred to the bench, the families had not spoken, and a small inheritance had gone the proud way, and not the poor way, and hard words had been said at a funeral 30 years gone that neither side would unsay. And so 2 branches of one blood had lived 12 miles apart in the same riding for a generation, and let the silence harden as the dale lets the frost harden the ground, until it seemed a thing that could not be broken. And the old woman growing old alone in her tower, with her husband dead, and her clock going and no child of her own, had come at the last to see the silence for what it was, her own pride as much as the dead grandfather's, and had not had the courage to write the one letter until she was old and wanted an heir, and had been too ashamed of the wanting to write it warmly, and had instead, in the way of proud, honest people, said her sorry in the only language she fully trusted, which was the language of provision. She had left the lesser branch the whole of the greater branch's house, and the clock above all, and had built into the gift a defence against the one man who would try to take it, so that the great niece should not only have the tower, but should have to fight for it and win it, and so make it truly her own. The apology was the house. The house was the apology, and Honoria, hearing the whole of it from the old curate by the library fire, understood her great-aunt entirely, for she was made of the same proud, honest stuff herself, and would have done, she thought, exactly the same. She wrote it out, in time, for herself. In a new commonplace book she began that spring under the old one, not the clock rates, which went in the rate book, but the common things, the verse and the weather and the price of wool, and now and then a line of her own. And the first line she set down in it was this: that a silence of 30 years had been ended by a clock that struck the truth, and that she meant to keep both the clock and the ending of the silence as long as she was able, and after. Sir Lewis Aldborough came over the moor that spring oftener than the bells of Whitcliffe strictly required, and the dale, which misses nothing, marked it kindly, for he was a good man and well liked, and these 5 years a lonely one, and Honoria was a woman the dale had taken to for her plain ways and her keeping of the old lady's clock. He came of a Tuesday with some matter of the bells, and stayed to the library tea, and he came of a Saturday, and brought Phoebe, and the child went up to the clock with Honoria and learned the wheels, drawing them in a little book in pencil, the going train and the striking train, and the way the one let off the other, with a child's careful patience until she could name every wheel in the movement and tell the strike from the going. And Sir Lewis sat below with the parish curate or the steward, and waited for the 2 of them to come down, and watched them come, the tall young woman and the small grave child, both with clock oil on their fingers, and did not trouble to hide from anyone what his face did when they came into the room. It went between Honoria and Sir Lewis, at the grave, unhurried pace of 2 people no longer young, who have each been long alone and know the worth of what is beginning and will not be hasty with it. They did not speak of it for a long while. They talked of bells and clocks and the keeping of old work, and of his great empty house at Aldborough, full of tuned bells and voiced organ pipes, and no one to play them to since his Isabel died, and of her father's shop in Skipton, which she had not yet given up, and the apprentice who kept it for her, and whether a woman could keep a tower and a trade both. And one evening, on the bell stage in the blue spring dusk, with the dale going dim below, and the first star out over the fell, he told her plainly, in his grave, quiet way, that he had not thought to care for anyone again after Isabel, and had made his peace with the bells and the child and the empty house, and that he had not been looking for this, and had found it, and that he was too old and too plain a man to court her with anything but the truth, which was that he would be glad beyond saying if she would think of becoming, in her own time and at her own word, the mistress of Aldborough as she was the mistress of Whitcliffe, and that Phoebe had asked him, only the week before, in the carriage going home, whether Miss Whitcliffe might come and live with them, and keep the bells and the clock, and teach her the wheels always, and that he had not known what to answer, and would Honoria tell him what to answer. Honoria stood on the bell stage with the true rung east bell cold beside her, and the dale going dark below, and the man waiting grave and still in the dusk, and she did not answer at once, for she was a woman who weighed a thing before she trusted her life to it. And then she said, quietly, that he might tell Phoebe yes. And Sir Lewis took her hand on the bell stage in the dark, the first time he had touched her, and held it, and neither of them said anything more. And below them in the dusk, the great clock let off the strike, and the deep bells spoke the hour out over the whole quiet dale. And that was the whole of their betrothal, told to nobody but the bells. He rode to Skipton the next day, and saw the apprentice and the shop, for he would not have her give up her trade for him, and said so, and they settled it between them, in the grave practical way of their kind, that the shop should not be sold, but kept. The apprentice raised to journeyman and set over it. The Whitcliffe sign of Daniel Whitcliffe's make kept living in the Skipton street, and that Honoria should keep the Whitcliffe clock herself, as long as she was able, riding or driving the 10 miles between Aldborough and Whitcliffe, as the old lady had walked her own dale, and should set Phoebe to learn it after her, so that the tower clock that had come to a clockmaker's daughter should pass, in its turn, to a hand that loved it. And he asked her, grave, whether she would look at the bells and the silent organ at Aldborough, and tell him honestly whether the empty north music room of his Isabel's might be opened again and made to sing. And Honoria said that she would. And so, the 2 empty places, his music room and her tower, that had each been kept shut around a grief, were to be opened, each by the other's hand. The half-mourning eased by the gentle reckoning of the dale, the 6 months past her great-aunt's death come round in the May, and Mrs. Dineley brought down from the old lady's press a soft grey spring gown of good stuff that the testatrix had not lived to wear, and Honoria took it into wear at Whitsun, the unrelieved black set by, and wore at her breast a sprig of the white pear blossom from the old orchard her great-aunt had planted. And the dale saw the new mistress of Whitcliffe come to St. Oswald's in grey, with pear blossom at her breast, and a baronet's grave eyes following her up the aisle, and was glad, for it loves a mending of things, and there had been little enough mending in that proud silent family for a generation. The estate itself came up under her keeping, as the spring came up the dale. Mr. Garnett, the steward, who had served the old lady 22 years, and feared at first a single woman's hand on the land, found the new mistress knew an account as well as he did, and would not be cheated and would not cheat, and gave her the steady loyalty of his kind. The 4 cottages were put in repair out of the clear rents that no longer stood in danger of going to Garsdale, the Pickard's roof mended before the back end, and old Widow Constable's chimney drawn that had smoked her out for years. The orchard was dressed, and the walled garden dug and cropped that had run half to weed in the old lady's last sick years, and the whole place, that had been going quietly down with its mistress, turned and came up again under a young keeping, so that by the midsummer Whitcliffe was a living estate again, and not a dying one, its clock going, its bells true, its cottages tight, its rents its own. And the clock above all, Honoria had Eli Sugden up once more in the early summer to go right through it, every pivot and bush and the worn parts renewed, the going barrel relined, the dial regilt, and the great gilt hand new-leafed, so that it stood out black and gold against the grey south face of the tower, and could be read clean across the dale. And when it was done, the 2 clockmakers, the old and the young, set it going, and rated it together over a fortnight, against the noon mark and the watch, until it kept time to a few seconds in the week, as good as the day it was new 300 years gone, and the dale, that had lived 40 days under a silent tower in the autumn and thought the old lady's clock had died with her, heard it strike the summer hours out strong and true over the hay meadows, and knew that the clock of Whitcliffe had not died, but had only changed hands, and would go on. It was the after-reveal of the whole matter, though none in the Dale used such a word. The tower that had stood silent and broken at the new mistress's coming, with its scape-wheel out and its hammers chalked, and a man at its foot swearing a lie about its bell, stood now at the height of summer regilt and going and true, striking its honest hours over a mended estate, kept by a clockmaker's daughter who had proved its silence and so saved its house, and where the great dial had stood still, at a little before noon on the grey December day, Honoria first drove up the dale. The new black and gold hand now moved, visibly, surely, tooth by tooth, across the summer afternoons, for any soul in the dale to look up and read the true time of day by the clock that had told the truth when it could not strike. They were married at St. Oswald's of Whitcliffe-le-Dale on a bright morning in the early September, a year and a little less since the old clock had stopped in the night with its broken tooth, 11 months since Honoria first drove up the frozen dale to a silent tower and a hard letter. The Reverend Ingleby read the service at the small chancel in his plain way before the dale gathered in, Mrs. Dineley in her best black, Mr. Coverdale straight-backed at the end of the Whitcliffe pew, Mr. Garnett scrubbed and uncomfortable in a good coat, the 4 tenant families in the body of the church, old widow constable weeping comfortably into a clean handkerchief as old women do at weddings, Mr. Joshua Skelton come up from Leeds to give the bride away, for she had no nearer man, and glad to do it, and old Eli Sugden, the clockmaker, in the second pew in a brushed brown coat, who had said he would not come to weddings as a rule, but would come to this one, for he had a hand in it, in a manner of speaking, having mended the clock that mended the family. Phoebe stood up with Honoria in a white frock, grave and proud, and held the bride's posy of late harebells and one white rose from the Aldborough garden when the ring went on, and Sir Lewis, in plain dark blue, his grey eyes steady, put the gold ring on the clockmaker's daughter's hand at the chancel rail in the bright September morning, and the thing that the old proud silent family had broken a generation gone was made whole at last at the altar of the Dale, in the sight of the whole parish, by the great niece of the woman who had not been able to mend it in her life, and had reached out of her grave to mend it with a tower and a clock. And as they came out at the church door into the sunlight, man and wife, the clock up on the Dale side above the river struck the hour of noon across the whole shining valley. 12 strokes, slow and deep and true, the regaled hand black and gold on the grey face, the sound rolling down over the hay meadows and the dry stone walls and the bright low river to the church door where the bride and groom stood. And the whole Dale heard it, the clock that had stood silent and dumb at the foot of whose stair a man had once sworn a lie, ringing out clean and honest over a wedding now, and more than one in that churchyard looked up at the tower when it struck, and understood, and was glad. There is an old saying in that Dale, that Honoria's great-aunt had written once in her commonplace book, and Honoria found there and kept, and it is the truest word on the whole matter, and it is this: a clock may be stopped, but it cannot be made to lie. The old woman had set it down, meaning her trade and her tower. It had come to mean a great deal more. The years that followed at Whitcliffe and Aldborough were good years, and life ran on in them and did not stand still. Honoria kept the Whitcliffe clock to the end of her days, and Phoebe learned it at her side and kept it after her, so the tower never wanted a hand that loved it. The empty music room at Aldborough was opened and made to sing, the silent organ voiced again, and the bells rung, and the great house that had been shut around a grief these 5 years was a house full of sound once more. Mr. Skelton wound up the old lady's affairs, and lived to a great age and a dry contentment. Eli Sugden mended the Whitcliffe clock twice more before he died, and the second time brought up a Skipton lad of his own apprenticing to learn the tower, that the trade should not die in the dale, and Hartas Bywell of Garsdale, who had come within a lie of bleeding a tower white, lived quiet and lessoned at Garsdale Head, and troubled the dale no more, and it was said he never could abide the sound of a striking clock to his dying day, which was a small enough penance, and more than some get. And old Bracken, who had kept the cold foot of the turret stair through a dead woman's silence, and got her bell back at the last, lived 2 more easy winters by a warm hearth, with her head on the new mistress's foot, and died old and full of years in her sleep one night, while the clock struck overhead, and was buried under the old pear tree in the orchard her mistress had planted, where the blossom comes down on the grass every spring. If you have stayed with me to the close of this story, I should be glad of one quiet word from you below. Tell me the county or the country you are listening from this evening, and tell me one thing in your own keeping, a clock, a chair, a garden, a name that came down to you from someone who is gone, and that you keep going for their sake. And if you have ever had to choose between the 2 hard goods this story sets side by side, I should like to know which way you chose, whether you have found, in your own life, that the better mending of a long silence is the warm word said while there is still time to say it, or whether, like Honoria's proud great-aunt, you have known that for some people the truest apology is not a word at all, but a thing built, quietly, with their own hands, for the one they wronged to find after they are gone. There is no wrong answer between them. There is only your own. If this story has been a comfort to your hour, you are warmly welcome to stay by this hearth a while. There is another Whispers of Love story waiting in its turn, of a sea captain's widow on the Northumberland coast, and the lamp she would not let go dark, and I should be glad of your company at it. Until then, be at your ease, and at your hearth, and at your hour, up on the dale side, when the wedding party had gone in to the breakfast, and the churchyard was empty, and the September afternoon lay gold and quiet on the valley, the great clock of Whitcliffe Tower went on as it had gone for 300 years, and would go for 300 more, the slow, heavy pendulum swinging in the cold of its chamber, the wheels turning tooth by tooth, the weights going down their dark shaft, the black and gold hand moving sure across the grey south face above the bright low river. And at the quarter it let off the strike, and the great bell spoke once over the empty churchyard and the mended cottages and the orchard where an old dog would one day sleep, and the sound rolled out over the whole quiet dale and died away into the hills, and the clock kept the time of the afternoon, and told no lie, and wanted no hand but the one that loved it.